Hello, welcome back. So far, we've been learning about checked exceptions, right? The ones that you have to do a catch and handle it, or use a throw statement to pass it up to the other method that was calling it. So that's how you handle checked exceptions. The second category of exceptions that are in Java are called unchecked exceptions or runtime exceptions that you don't necessarily normally handle because they are problems in your program that have to be fixed, right? If you go to Google and then say Java 8 exception, we're going to go to the API. So we saw earlier exception is a superclass that has a bunch of exceptions, child class, right? Subclasses. If you see runtime exception and select that guy, so this is the runtime exception that we are currently talking about. It has a bunch of subclasses as well, like null pointer or array store exception or arithmetic exception, right? Stuff like that. So these are all runtime exceptions that you can catch if you want, but this actually, if you handle it or catch it or do it right, it kind of masks the actual problem. So it's not normally good to have runtime exceptions. If you have runtime exceptions, you have something wrong in the code that you need to fix. So we can see something like some example of it. If you go back to Eclipse, and then we will create a new class, and let's just say it's called runtime exceptions test. Hit finish. Now let's say you want to create an array. So let's say int numbers equals 1, 2, 3. If we say system.out.println numbers of 5, so we're trying to display value in a position that doesn't exist. So if you do a right click, run as Java application, you're going to get an array index out of bounds exception, right? Let's click it, or let's go to this symbol open type. We're going to say array index out of bounds, which extends index out of bounds. So let's open that declaration. That extends the runtime exception, right? So anything that extends runtime exception, you don't necessarily want to do a try catch because this statement did not force us to catch anything, right? Earlier, when we saw open file or file reader, those methods threw an exception that we were forced to catch, right? But this is not throwing anything, right? It's not forcing us to catch, which is why they're not checked exceptions. But what this tells us is there's something wrong in the code where we are trying to read a position that doesn't exist, right? Or something like this: string name equals null, and then let's say we want to say system dot out dot println name dot length, right? We're trying to call the length method on an object that doesn't exist. All we have is just a reference to nothing, right? If I comment this out, because we don't want to end here, right? If I run it, it's going to fail with the same exception. I want to skip that part. So if you run it again, now you get a null pointer exception, right? Let's see what null pointer exception has. Null pointer extends runtime exception, right? So runtime exceptions are those that you were not forced to guard, but when they happen, they actually tell you there is something really wrong with the code that we need to fix. So runtime exception is not really normally good to have. If you're getting runtime exceptions, it means there is something wrong that you need to fix in the program, right? But you don't necessarily have to catch it. There's nothing wrong in catching it. For example, if I comment this out again and then say try here, we can say catch array index out of bounds exception ex, say system dot out dot println index out of bounds. If we were to run it, we're going to get index out of bounds, right? So we were able to handle it. There is nothing wrong in handling it, right? But if you're getting runtime exception, you normally don't catch here. You would fix the problem in the code that actually ends up causing that problem, right? One way to look at the difference between a checked exception and an unchecked exception is you can make anything a checked exception if the program can recover from it, right? Let's say you have a bunch of statements in try block, right? If something fails, if you're able to recover from that error, if the program can be recovered from that problem by handling that exception, you will make it a checked exception, right? If there is something wrong with the program, um, throws an exception which it cannot recover from, then you will make it a runtime exception. Let's say you're trying to open a file from a disk, right? But the disk itself doesn't exist. Let's say there is a hardware failure where you're not even able to read the disk, right? That would clearly be an example of a runtime exception because the program cannot recover from it. If it wants to read the file, if it has to read some file for the program to continue, but then that disk itself it doesn't exist, that would be a runtime problem that needs to be resolved, right? So it would not make any sense to check for it, handle it in the program. So that's the difference between a checked exception and a runtime exception. Um, and that's basically how you would think about the problem to decide what type of exception you would want to use in your program. So hope that made sense. That's basically the second type of exception that is in Java, which is the runtime exception or unchecked exceptions. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.